But before we start, for those of you who are new to Greening Stenning, we're an organisation representing, promoting green agenda within Stenning, Bramber and Upper Beeding. Some of you, maybe most of you, will have been on our countdown event last week. We've now got over 1,000 members and well over 100 volunteers. In fact, I think we got about 20 new volunteers last week. So we're growing quickly. We're involved in a lot of areas and we'd love to hear from you. And you can go to the Greening Stenning website, and I think somebody could put the address in chat, that would be great, and join us. We also have green book events, green events, drinks events on the last Tuesday of every month. And at the end of May, we've got a really interesting one called Can We Eat Our Way to a Greener Stenning, which is really an informal event all about food and food miles and food waste and poverty and sustainable food production. We'll be talking to some terrific lifestyle bloggers who live very green, simple lives, and we'll be having videos and conversations. So if you're interested in that, please sign up again on Greening Stenning. So we're delighted tonight to welcome our guest speaker, Chris Goodall. And Chris is the author of several successful books, and he's written for The Guardian, Environmental Network, and other energy sites such as Abundance and The Ecologist. His latest book, which we'll be largely discussing, you can see next to me here, is What We Need to Do Now, which is an urgent, practical, and inspiring book that signals a Green New Deal for Britain. He also runs the excellent Carbon Commentary website, covering topics across the energy, technology, and finance around the world. And also Solar Forecast, which gives a uniquely accurate forecast of UK solar power output over the next 5 days. So Chris's expertise really lies in global approaches to low carbon energy generation, low carbon heat, electric cars and battery storage, as well as carbon capture and geoengineering. And hopefully we'll be talking about all of those. So a big welcome to you, Chris. And perhaps we could start by talking about your book, What We Need to Do Now. You know, what was your thinking behind it? What's the big idea in the book?
Well, I'm not sure there's a big idea there, but what I thought it was important to do was to give people a sense of...
Oh, they're just looking after other people at the moment.
Could you mute, please? Can everybody mute? It's very important. Thank you. Sorry, Chris.
Not at all. Give everybody a sense of the variety of things we needed to change about the way we live as a global society if we're to get to this idea of net zero by 2050 or before, probably before. So I thought, well, there's a lot of attention paid, particularly in the UK, to the creation of renewable energy generation, but not enough about the other things which really matter and which actually are often much more difficult to do anything about. The food system, our travel habits, the heating of our homes, where the UK has some uniquely difficult problems to address. We have some of the worst insulated homes in Europe, possibly the worst. Approximately 3 times as much heat leaks from the typical UK home per square metre as it would do in similar circumstances in Germany. We also travel more by air than any other country in the world. Something that I think possibly we're not quite as aware of as we might. And air travel is possibly the most difficult thing to decarbonise of all. So I want to write across the broad spectrum of things that create emissions or make life less green than it should be. I try to offer an alternative and say this is probably roughly what we need to do if we're to achieve our climate objectives.
Do you think people in the UK really understand what's happening with climate change, and but not just the severity, but the key facts? You mentioned you had some slides to share with us.
Well, I just wanted to go through, I did a presentation to a law firm a couple of weeks ago, which was entitled 4 Uncomfortable Truths. And I thought we might just very, very briefly just dash through those, because those cover the areas where entities like Greening Stenning will need to focus, because that's where local community associations can make a difference and where government, frankly, isn't doing enough yet. So I can try it. Look, it's too long to dash through now, but I just hit some of the main points. And right at the end, I put one slide where I thought I might offer some ideas as to what green extending itself might want to do about these four different problems.
Excellent.
This is not an attempt to prescribe, but it's really an attempt to say, look, we have a problem here and we really ought to be working on it. Now, can you see a PowerPoint?
We can.
Right. Okay. I'm really just going to dash through this. It's not an attempt to give a lecture. This is a conversation, and the more questions and answers we have, the better. Right. So the areas that I focus on in this talk are food and agriculture, travel, particularly aviation, domestic buildings, and that's primarily about insulation, and clothing. Where we need to, like everything else, really significantly change the way we do things. Clothing, in one sense, is the worst exemplar of the way we are using up resources, employing a new item of clothing for a few times and then throwing it away, and it's never recycled. It simply goes into waste. We've got to change that. So very briefly, agriculture, and this is something I think people don't really understand. Agriculture is responsible for about a quarter of world emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, of which 15% is livestock, and at least 10% of that is cattle. It's very difficult to see how we can build a zero carbon society with the existing levels of meat eating. I make the argument in the book that we should be really thinking about changing our monoculture as well. This is John Letts, who's a smallholder with a few tens of hectares around Oxfordshire, who cultivates medieval varieties of grain. Lots of good ecological reasons to do that, including on the right-hand side, the fact that because the roots of these plants are very much deeper, they're very much more resistant to summer drought. And that's going to be an increasing problem for South and Eastern UK. This is a chart about how even a city like Sheffield can produce a large quantity of its own fruit and vegetables from inside the boundaries of the city, from using land that could be employed to grow these things. We need to reforest, and that's particularly salient, I'm afraid, in regions like the South Downs, because beautiful as they are, those landscapes are probably need to be reforested. We need to insulate our homes better. This is an example of a housing development in a complete refurbishment in Nottingham of some 1950s houses, which were extremely expensive, and where the insulation standards have improved. We can talk about the ways in which that might happen. We also, of course, need to build every new house to a zero carbon standard. That means not just the use of energy during the life of the house, but what's embedded in it as it's built. We need to move to active travel, as it's called. On the left-hand side, what cycle parking is like in the city of Utrecht around the railway station, 35,000 bicycle parking places in a city of 300,000 homes. We need to move to car-free areas within our towns and cities, and possibly also villages as well. Very uncomfortable, extremely difficult politically to implement, but nevertheless, every country, every city that's tried it has in the end thought it's a good idea. Flying, really big problem. We can't decarbonize flying. We're going to continue to have to use kerosene or something like it for a long time. This is a fancy notion from Airbus. We can move to hydrogen, probably very difficult for long distance flying. So we need to ask ourselves, can we avoid flying? Can we minimize the amount of flying we do? Because for the average British person, it's a middle class traveller, it's probably something like 15 or 20% of total emissions. Need to do something about clothing. We need to move away from polyester and cotton particularly because of its environmental impact in countries which are water stressed, more towards, of course, long-term use of clothing, but also to fabrics made from wood and bamboo, such as tencel, which these attractive young people here are wearing. Right, just a few notes on what community association might do in Stenning. I'm very interested in thinking about whether it's possible to get community horticulture going. It really ought to be, particularly as the supply chain gets more stressed because of Brexit and other things between the UK and main suppliers in the Netherlands and in Spain. I was going to suggest in bold there that anybody interested in this, trying to get better things grown in the area, community horticulture implemented, planting trees, might have a look at what I think is a truly exceptional organisation, the Kindling Trust on the outskirts of Manchester, which is looking at doing all that. Amongst other things, it's training potential horticulturalists. There are a lot of people who would like to grow the fruit and veg on a commercial basis. They're often unskilled and they need to learn. It's very difficult to do so, except at great expense. They also need access to land, and that's the most difficult thing, because land ownership in the UK, as everybody knows, is concentrated in a small number of entities, individuals, and it's very difficult to get them acre, 2 acres, a hectare, or whatever, to do small scale horticulture. But that's something which perhaps your association could do. Housing. We really do need to make a difference to insulation standards. And the striking thing is, even after 15, 20 years of worrying about this, we really don't know why houses in the UK are quite as bad as they are and what we might do about it. So once again, an opportunity, some really detailed work on heat loss, air tightness in your houses would provide something which would be possibly very useful to the world, to the UK in general, if you show what works and what doesn't work. Local cycleways, I think, and particularly in your area, more electric car charging points, and trying to find ways of reducing commuting need. Clothing, I think you're probably working on this already from what I hear, but getting local people trained into refashioning clothing is seeming to work well in some parts of the UK, and I put up there an illustration of the Clothing Warehouse Limited. That's a website that's worth looking at. On energy, it's now possible, probably at least on big building roofs, to build solar panels without subsidy. It makes sense financially without subsidy, which is the situation one has today. And there, I'd suggest going to something called the Big Solar Co-op to think about ways in which you could cooperate with that to build either megawatt scale, large scale solar installations on farmland, but also looking at any buildings, schools or whatever, public buildings in your area where you could put solar productively on the roof. Thank you, Paul. I'm sorry, I'm possibly taking too long. Those are some things.
Where do you think within the overall picture, Chris, that communities fit in? Because I mean, one of the big challenges in the environment is the general public seem to think it's down to the government to change, or big business, or fossil fuels, or something like Silicon Valley will do with computing, just come and change everything. And then you've got the fossil fuel companies saying, oh, it's down to individuals now. One of the big lies. Where do we fit in? Where do communities fit in?
I don't know. Look, the thing I would stand back and say is, look, we know we ought to do this. We're probably going to enjoy doing it. It's a good thing to do. It improves our lives. So let's do it. Let's not worry about whether it's our responsibility or not. Let's just get on with it, because it's going to bring the community together. It's going to reduce our emissions. It's probably going to make us healthier. No good reason not to do it, I would say. And we can, obviously, you're going to be an exemplar to other communities. If you do that, you're going to make life better for businesses that are trying to operate ethically as well. It's just part of a broad social movement. Everybody needs to be involved in this. But the thing that I would say is that it's fun. It's enjoyable getting it right.
That's very much, that's very much the idea of greening standing. It's not just doing good, and reducing emissions, it's bringing people and communities together. And there's so many benefits of volunteering and being part of something. Are there any communities or any best practices that you think have got it right around the world, whether it be a community or town or city?
Well, there's lots of places, as you know, which are doing individual things. I think, let me try and think of a few examples. Well, I mentioned Utrecht. That's a much bigger town than you. Really systematic attempt to reduce car travel, working. Over 50% of transport now is active travel, walking or bicycling inside the city boundaries. There let me think. There are local horticulture. You'll probably know this as much as I do. Many places have now got small-scale community gardens. I think it's possible to do it on a larger scale, and to try and make community agriculture work. And I mentioned Kindling Trust, which is on the outskirts of Manchester, as an exemplar of what can be done. They're just in the process, by the way, of raising the cash to buy the farmland to create a full-scale farm, 120 acres, for community horticulture and other things. So that, yeah, I could go through towns and cities. There's no single place, however, where everything is being done in a green fashion yet that I've come across. We're tending to be sorry, excuse me, rabbiting on here, but in the UK we're slightly behind the best communities in Northwest Europe. We're in our understanding of the issue and the painful actions we're taking to try and do something about it.
Do you think technology can save us?
Technology is going to help, but as it were, Bill Gates' view that it's only technology we need and we can continue to live the lives that we've always lived, I think is dangerously false. It induces a complacency. It makes us wash our hands and say it's not our responsibility. No, we've really messed things up over the last 2 generations. And we owe it to the generations to come to try and get things sorted out. That requires major lifestyle changes.
And what about COP26? Is it really our last best chance to do something?
Well, we've been saying that, haven't we, for 20 to 30 years.
Easily, yeah.
I don't think this is going to be any different. It's part of the painful move to get governments and large companies to realize this is for real. We cannot avoid making these changes, and the longer we take, the worse it's going to get. There is no single date by which it's too late. There's no single event which is going to make the difference. It is this the thing which makes me, and as I said to you earlier before the conversation started, I'm a deeply pessimistic person. I'm not certain the world's going to get around this problem. But the last year has made even me optimistic on some days, as particularly large companies come to realize that their future is going to be very different to their past, whether it be the large oil companies or companies in the food industry deciding that they can no longer make the ultra-processed, high environmental impact food that they've been doing so far. So COP is going to be helpful, and it's helpful in the UK because the government is aware that it has to do things during the course of the next 6 months, which are in line with what it's going to be trying to persuade people to do in Glasgow in November. So it's helpful. It's certainly caused the likely cancellation of the coal mine project in Cumbria, which would have been so destructive to the UK's reputation. But we've got a long way to go before this government or any other government accepts that many things have to change, uncomfortable things have to change.
And one of the things we talked about on our previous call was about community energy schemes, and that's something we're looking at here. Any advice there, any specific advice or thoughts on that?
Well, I think working with other people. Look, I've seen a lot of community energy schemes over the last 10 years and run by truly exceptional people who've all found it extremely difficult to do. You can, I think now, work with other groups around the country through the big solar co-op that I mentioned to begin the process of trying to work out how to do it most efficiently and least painfully. I'm talking principally about solar because that's what's going to work. You're in a good site for solar. You're near the south coast. You're going to have high solar insolation levels, and so it's going to make more money. Good south-facing roofs, farmland which isn't much used, which is probably being used for sheep at the moment, conversion into solar. You can make that work. You can make money from it. No question about it. It's not going to make anybody rich, but it does return sufficient money to cover its costs.
Oh, definitely. One of the things I noticed recently when I was talking to people when we were promoting our countdown event, quite a few people said to me, well, you know, what can we do? It's all down to the Chinese, the Americans, the Indians. And and it makes you feel, some people, disempowered. But is there one thing that we should be doing as individuals, as families, as homeowners, that not making a difference on that scale, but at least it can, you know, any advice you give?
Well, I think the first point to make about the comparison with China and India is we had the benefit of cheap fossil fuel energy from 1770 onwards as the Industrial Revolution took place and coal became widely available across the canal network. So I can't remember exactly how much of the world's CO2 in the atmosphere is due to our activities up to now, but it's something like 7 or 8%. We were a major cause of climate change. A reasonably large fraction of climate change thus far is derived from the fact that the UK benefited from cheap energy earlier than anywhere else in the world. So we have a responsibility to do it. So that's the moral argument. The practical argument is the world is moving in this direction. So if the UK doesn't follow or doesn't lead it, it's going to be consigned to a role which is unattractive in the sense that incomes will be lower, our standard of living will be lower. We have to drive this. We have no alternative. And there are certain areas of competence which the UK has, chemical engineering, for example, where we might really be able to make a difference and gain an advantage, which produces lower climate change, but also good jobs, incomes for everybody, returns to shareholders. And I think we've just got to learn to assume that the world of 30 years, in 30 years' time, is going to be very different from what it is today. And rather than just resisting it or passively accepting it when other people impose it on us, we should be trying to lead this. As I said, also, this is going to be a much more interesting future than if we just try and slow things down in the way that we've been doing so far.
So I'm just looking at some of the questions. One more question before we take audience questions. A lot of people are talking about carbon capture now, and I know obviously Bill Gates did in his new book, and other business people, scientists. What's your views on that? And also view about saving forests. You know, should forests and natural ecosystems be the ultimate carbon capture?
Well, I'm almost certain that we need large-scale carbon capture directly from the atmosphere. That is to say, molecules of carbon dioxide sitting there in the air around us will need to be brought out of the air and dumped into the ground, safely stored forever. So it's not a popular technology to advocate because people say, oh, this will just let the fossil fuel companies continue with what they're doing. But I'm afraid, I think it's very, very likely that we'll find that the consequences of climate change are so severe that we will need to take action, every action that we can possibly come up with to reduce carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And also, I suspect, once again, this is deeply unpopular with the environmental movement, we need geoengineering. We need to stop as much solar energy reaching the Earth's surface. My goodness, people don't want to discuss that. Bill Gates is behind it, but I think he's utterly right in this case. We need to investigate reflecting some part of the sun's energy back out into space, because otherwise I think we're going to find in certain parts of the world that the consequences of climate change are going to be utterly, totally catastrophic.
Absolutely. Would you include nuclear energy?
I've no objection to nuclear energy personally, so I'm not a traditional environmentalist by any standards, but I just think that it is absolutely not cost competitive with solar power. Solar power is now, in the words of the International Energy Agency, not a bunch of radical hippies, the cheapest electricity source that's ever been seen in world history. Let's use that. And you there, not far from the south coasts, really have very good access, and low temperatures, relatively low temperatures help for solar PV. You're not in a bad position at all to capitalize on the opportunities to generate your own electricity.
Great. Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. We've got a question here from, I believe it's Mike Dixon. Can we sustain traditional GDP growth? Is it sustainable?
Well, I don't think it should be our objective, if I may say. So I think we should try and invent some accounting system which doesn't prioritize GDP growth. Oh, one gets involved in arguments about this. GDP growth doesn't have to be bad for carbon intensity. GDP growth has given us these little supercomputers, which would have taken hundreds of kilograms of machines to replace the fax machine, the printer, and so on, the telephone. I'm not making my point very effectively. I don't think we should be against the growth of GDP, but we absolutely should not be prioritizing it. And we should include in our assessment of GDP, if we decide to continue using it, the real running down of our natural capital. Sorry, I was trained as an economist, so I talk in cliches some of the time, economics cliches. When I mean natural capital, I mean the ability of the world to sustain itself through nature forever. We have built large part of our GDP growth over the last century on the basis of running down, using up our resources of natural capital. This has to stop. And we ought to prioritize the creation of human well-being, which is partly to do with economics, but mostly to do with our sense of connection to our community, having a role in life and feeling that what we're doing is good for future generations. These are things which don't get put much into political leaflets. I've had nothing about this pushed through the door prior to these local elections, for example.
Here's a question from Mark. As individuals and green groups, we have a limited resource and can't do everything. Therefore, which of the 4 or 5 areas that you mentioned should we make our top priority?
Well, look, where I think the most leverage that you could generate is in community agriculture. Trying to do something on a reasonable scale which brought food production back into your local area and altered the nature of what is farmed. Now, you need a landowner or landowners who is intensely sympathetic to that. So you can't do it on you. If you haven't got land, you can't do this. But there are enough people now who are saying, actually, I don't particularly want to keep my land in sheep where I'm just running off subsidies and destroying the local environment. I will let you rent this 10-acre patch, and you can use it to train people in horticulture, giving relatively good jobs to people who might not otherwise get them, and to localize some portion of your food production. Now, there's just not enough of this going on in the UK, and you've got relatively good circumstances to do it. Soil's not great, it has to be said, but there are probably places within your area that it's going to be possible to do some of this.
A question from Jeff and Sally. What do you think about the zero carbon Britain model from the Centre of Alternative Technology? Are there better ones you know? It also, it might be worth mentioning, Chris, for those who are not so sure, to define what zero carbon and net zero is, because there's quite a few of these terms being used at the moment.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, absolutely, I apologize. I use words like that without properly defining them. So what the government says is they want to be net zero by 2050 or before, I can't remember the latest promise. That means to say that across all the activities in the UK, there is no net addition of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And that should include things which have been excluded so far, which include international aviation and shipping, and also the carbon footprint of the things we import, the large number of things we import, food, electronics, etc. So that's the ambition. That's net zero. Absolute zero is where we don't, net zero involves possibly some offsetting. That is to say, we still have some emissions, but we capture in one way or another through forestry or whatever, or through direct air capture, an equivalent amount of emissions. Okay, going back to the Centre for Alternative Technology proposals, yes, I agree with that. I think they don't work. They don't actually, surprisingly, possibly don't look enough at the lifestyle changes which we need to encompass. But when it comes to energy generation, yes, 100%.
Is there another model that we should be considering other than the zero carbon Britain model?
There are lots of them floating around. Can I offer one which would be any more systematic? Any more inclusive? I'm not certain. because it's very uncomfortable to start saying to people, look, you can't fly anymore and you can't eat meat. That's not a way to gain funding from large organizations, but those are among the lifestyle changes which we will probably need to make.
Yeah, we're all skirting around the gorilla in the room, aren't we? Changing our lifestyle. We'll talk about anything other than that. Here's a question from Tony Edwards. How can we best encourage ordinary people to tell their politicians that we will not vote for them unless they deal with this terrible climate crisis? And, how can we exert influence on politicians, do you think, other than voting Green?
Well, I'm standing for election as a Green councillor today. I won't get many votes, but I give you that's my judgment. What I really would like is if the progressive environmental movements in the UK were able to combine, whether they be in the Labour Party or in the Green Party or wherever, so that we became an effective force making the case for fairly substantial lifestyle changes. I don't see that happening. We're stuck in the first past the post system, which is destroying the prospects of real cooperation and conciliation amongst the various groups. Politicians, in my experience, do respond to pressure from their electorate. They may not write back an intelligent response to one's points, but that MP is logging every single letter and working out where the balance of opinion lies. So the more communications with MPs, or going up to them when they're canvassing in the street saying, I really want you to be more environmentally conscious. I want you to move your government. In the case of your MP, obviously a highly able individual, who's very successful career before politics, who seems to be utterly on board now. The more you say to him when you meet him, look, this is something that matters to me. I may not be one of your voters, but I really think you should be doing this. It does influence them, no question about it.
What do you think would need to happen for it to have a real tipping point where every party had the environment front and centre, rather like Joe? It seems like Joe Biden has done that to some extent, although it's around green jobs.
And look what's happened in Germany in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So all of a sudden, we've got a Green Party that's in the lead in the opinion polls across the whole of Germany, with a capable and persuasive, charismatic potential chancellor candidate. And all of a sudden, the Merkel government is pivoting as fast as it can towards more aggressive intervention on climate. For example, Peter Altmaier, finance minister, saying this week that they'll subsidize the conversion of the steel industry towards using hydrogen. By the way, most of my work at the moment is on hydrogen. This is the subject of the moment, but it's not necessarily something which can be done locally, but it's the most effective way of decarbonizing the most difficult sectors. But just making the point there is that politics works. In well-run societies, the growth of effective green movements has been very good at influencing the whole debate across all parts of the political spectrum.
We had a question here from Tony saying, I read that 1/3 of all gas and oil wells leak, so would be no good for carbon capture and storage.
Yeah.
Is that?
Well, I'm not sure that they leak. Right. I think there are major leaks from gas wells, no question about that. And that's producing one of the reasons why the methane's a very dangerous global warming gas, why methane levels in the atmosphere are rising faster than anybody's ever expected. So gas wells leak gas, no question about that. Oil wells, I'm not certain leak onto the surface very much. And in general, it ought to be possible to pump carbon dioxide into oil wells, depleted oil wells, and store it there. I suspect better is to pump it into basalt, which is underneath large parts of the UK. Basalt takes carbon dioxide and it changes the rock into another type of rock naturally, and that's permanent. And there's no question of that leaking out. And that's the technology that's being used in Iceland by the world leader in capture of carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere, a Swiss company called Climeworks. And I think we should be looking intensely at what Climeworks is doing and working out whether it's going to be useful for the UK.
A question from Russell here, and I think this is, something we see again and again, is that can the vast majority of people actually adapt their lifestyles to the extent necessary to achieve meaningful change? He's pointed out that wealthier people can buy electric cars, put on solar panels, but it's always been seen as a white middle class movement, hasn't it? The environmental movement.
Yeah, but if you look at the surveys, concern about climate and willingness to take action is pretty evenly spread across all social groups. Yes, in the richer, well-educated communities, concern is higher. Obviously, for perfectly understandable reasons, other concerns tend to be more important in other groups. But there's absolutely no doubt about it. Concern about the long-term future of the environment is rising across all parts of our demographic spectrum. So yes, okay, not everybody can afford to put solar panels on their roof, and it's still more expensive to buy properly green electricity than ordinary electricity, for want of a better word. But it's not that much more expensive. Yes, we can't all afford to buy new electric cars. If we have to have a car, and many of us do, I know, particularly in rural areas, we can think about buying second-hand, or we can move, let's hope, to cycling. Obviously, cycling at the moment is seen as dangerous. It's not something which wealthy people do because they've got a big car, but nevertheless, it is becoming easier to do it in many parts of Britain. We need to push for low traffic neighbourhoods. That's probably not relevant to the sort of communities you are, but nevertheless, there are places where, in Horsham, for example, where this would be effective. So the answer is yes. It's easier for wealthy people to take action. On the other hand, wealthy people are in general responsible for many times the carbon footprint of the less well-off proportion of society. We've all seen the data in recent weeks about the percentage of all flights that are taken by people in the top 1% of the income distribution. It's truly horrifying. Trying to persuade people that that is not the right way to behave, it would be a good start.
And here we've had a question, which I've heard from other people, from Mike. Is net zero carbon a modern corporate contract to make them look, is it like the new greenwash, basically, or is it something more than that?
It might be from some corporations, but whenever I talk to companies, I am deeply impressed by the seriousness with which they're taking that their objective to get to net zero as soon as possible. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the vast bulk of companies here and around the world are truly committed to this. They don't quite know how they're going to do it. Some of the things that they do are gestures, but deep down in those organizations are people fighting very hard indeed to get the company to realize that its future depends on it. I have to say, I've done some small amounts of work for large companies recently, not in the fossil fuel industry itself, but where they have high carbon footprints. And I have no doubt whatsoever that they're doing their best. And I'm a cynic, absolutely.
Yes. How important is recycling? Question from Mark. It seems there's no uniformity between different areas. And we were talking yesterday on our meeting about how so much recycling ends up being burnt in China and other places. Yeah. What's your view of recycling?
Anyway, I think China's said no thank you now to this. Right. Recycling isn't enough. We need to design in full what's called circularity. We take something, we use it, we then return it to where it's reprocessed and becomes used again. So we still have a single direction of travel. Something's extracted, oil, whatever, is extracted from the earth. It's turned into a product, perhaps some packaging. We use it, and then we try to recycle it. We ought not to be doing that. We ought to make sure everything is designed so that actually reuse is what we're engaged in. And it's not just about plastics, it is about the things that often have a higher carbon footprint, such as clothing or electronics, where we need to be buying things, we need to be able to buy things which are fully reusable, not just recyclable.
Are there any examples of the circular economy you think we should be looking at, where, you know, it's a closed loop and we don't just waste things?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. Well, I did suggest in my annotated suggestions, as you might think about trying to develop proper reusability for clothing in your local area. People want to reuse clothes. They want them to be recycled. They want them to be to continue to be in use. Very, very few clothes are thrown away because they're too worn. So developing competence in your local area, what might be called sort of needlework skills, rebuilding, refashioning clothing, so that it's usable by other people or for in different circumstances, is, I think, something which we need to focus on. Those skills used to exist in our communities. We didn't throw clothing away. It's only in the last 20, 50 years that this has become a problem. We need to go back to that. Most people would like to, when asked, most people, they'd say that they would like to be able to have a fully circular clothing system. The problem, of course, is that what this is going to do for the living standards of people in those countries where low-cost clothing is made, Cambodia, Vietnam, places like that. So we need to work out on a global level exactly how we're going to rebuild the clothing supply system so that it doesn't continue to use vast quantities of resources, water, fossil fuels.
Definitely. Question from Fred. Is 2050 too late? Do we need a more ambitious timescale or goal?
I'm pretty certain we're going to decide that we do, to be honest. I'm not a scientist, but I look at the science and see what people are saying. The more I hear from scientists, the more they feel that to keep within 2 degrees, I think 1.5 degrees is probably almost unattainable now. To keep within 2 degree temperature rise, we're going to have to get to net zero faster. There's lots of mathematics behind this, and I'm not saying I'm completely on top of it, but the direction of travel is clear, that actually it would be vastly better for the future of humanity if we could get to net zero earlier than 2050.
And here's a question from Frank. To what extent would carbon taxation combined with measures to reduce inequality allow our society as a whole to drive down greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah. It's one of the themes that I try to put into the book, is just how improving equality across every part of society, whether it be educational standards, wealth, access to cultural resources, would be good for building up a sense of shared purpose in our life, which we've lost in the last 40 or 50 years. The first part of that question concerns carbon taxation. That is to say, if someone makes or uses something which involves the emission of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, they're charged for that. That's called generally carbon taxation. Because I'm trained in economics, I think that's absolutely vital. And I think a relatively low carbon tax imposed across the world on everything would be the single quickest and most effective and least painful way of getting to net zero quickly. But getting political support behind this isn't easy. French government is pushing it hard, some other governments around the world. But because it involves raising the price of some things, it's deeply politically contentious, even though you could then give back that taxation to less well-off people to make sure that they weren't net losers from this. But so that's something to keep pressurizing Andrew Griffith on. He'll understand this, and it's a relatively low carbon taxation level of, say, $60 per tonne, which is not much above the current level of the carbon tax in the European electricity energy trading emissions trading scheme, would be the single quickest way of decarbonising industry.
Is it true, Chris, that fossil fuel businesses around the world still get hundreds of billions of subsidies?
Depends what you define as subsidy, I'm afraid. For example, as large fossil fuel companies withdraw from the North Sea, having depleted the main oil fields, they are getting paid. They're getting paid by HM Treasury. That's an example. Is that a subsidy, or was it just something that was agreed in the past to recompense them for closing down their operations? I don't know. But there are lots of places in the world where fossil fuel is subsidised, where petrol is cheaper on the streets because the government pays part of the bill. In the UK, the VAT on our utility bills is 5%. The rest of our expenditure is largely at 20%. Should it be at 20%? If not, is it a subsidy? I personally think we probably do need to put VAT up to 20% on gas and electricity, but at the same time, insulating our houses better in a systematic, sustained way, and making sure that the least well-off parts of the community don't suffer from it.
And we've got a question here from Tony and Viv. Should we stress carbon budget rather than zero carbon date, rather than a zero carbon date as such? Yeah.
Yeah. So of course, yeah. You're absolutely right. Questioners, I can't argue against that at all. That's absolutely what it's really all about. What the science is about. How much carbon can we continue in total? Can we throw up into the atmosphere and hope to keep within our targets? Problem is explaining that. It's difficult enough to explain what net zero is to the average member of the population, not to the people in your group who will all understand this, but out on the streets, you ask people what net zero is or means, and you get not particularly well-informed replies. The majority of people in the UK, I think, if I remember the survey correctly recently, don't realise that burning natural gas for central heating purposes is emitting carbon. So we can't assume a high level of knowledge in the wider community.
Do you think there's a general problem in terms of the phrases that we use and the terminology within the environment, but it does put off people, or it doesn't? You know, for years we had this term sustainability. It's not the most positive phrase ever invented.
No. I don't know, because I'm as guilty of uttering cliche, sort of environmentalist cliches as anybody. It's nice to be precise, but the more precise you are, the less you communicate in some ways if the audience isn't engaged. I think we probably, in the environmental movement, we should all move to talking about making lives better rather more than reducing carbon emissions. Because that's what I think for all of us in your group, for scientists, business people working in this area, this is what in the end it's all about. Not some abstract notion of reducing our personal responsibility for climate change, but saying working together, we can build a better society, which also, by the way, won't use fossil fuels anymore.
And an area that's always really interests me is behavioural change. That's, if you like, my day job. Have you seen good examples of where people have, really good practice of changing behaviour in terms of not buying solar or not buying electric cars, but actually reducing and simplifying your lifestyle and making the sort of sacrifices that we will need to make?
Well, just some obvious examples. The no-fly movement is becoming increasingly effective. No question about that. That's a difficult lifestyle choice to make. But really, how much, for most people, is that a significant reduction in standard of living? I don't know. I travel around Europe. I only do so on trains. it can be a bit difficult, but it's actually more fun than going to Heathrow Airport, as I remember it. Active travel. Active travel works. Changing diet. The growth of the vegan movement in this country, but more acutely in some other parts of the world, is strikingly rapid, particularly amongst young people. These lifestyle changes looked as though they were totally impossible even 5 years ago. But the momentum there, the rolling of the snowball on things like changing diet, is unstoppable.
No, definitely. So any closing thoughts? I mean, we haven't had any more questions. If anyone's got any final questions, do add them now. But any closing thoughts or things you think we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about, Chris, that you think we should be hearing?
No, it's very kind of you to give me this opportunity to rabbit on, actually. I don't know.
No, not at all. We want to hear from you.
No, I don't. Look, in the book, I deal section by section of our sector by sector of our daily lives, and insulation of our homes, the food we eat, the amount we travel, how we travel, and things like that. Just the final point is, none of this is particularly easy, but doing it together as a community is going to make it much more fun than if we isolate ourselves and try and do it on our own.
No, it's a very good point. And that's something we really stress here within Greening Standing, because changing your lifestyle, making these changes on your own, as you say, is very hard. And there's been multiple studies of successful local campaigns where people working together increase the odds of it happening tremendously because of peer pressure and social support. But it's, as you said, it is more fun. It ticks an awful lot of boxes working together and those of us, have children, grandchildren, it's a spiritual issue. It's a very profound psychological need to help future generations.
I remember when I started on this route, the first book was published 13 or 14 years ago. I was pushing things like Don't Fly, and it felt extremely isolating, to be frank. Now it's socially acceptable, and doing it together makes it somehow much easier.
No, definitely. I just had one final question come in. It'd be a lighter, well, maybe a lighter note, I'm not sure. In your experience of our current crop of politicians, are there any you particularly rate? Anyone we should be looking out for as a future Greta Thunberg or David Attenborough?
I'm a Green Party candidate, and I stood for the general election once in this constituency. Who do you think I'm going to say?
Caroline?
Yeah, I'm obviously, like many of us, a great admirer of hers, and I wish we had an electoral system which rewarded the Green Party for its really now substantial support across the UK. People don't vote for the Green Party. That a lot of people would like to vote for the Green Party were it possible to do so and keep the bad guys out. Unfortunately, in our current system, this is impossible. And it's very difficult to see Caroline being joined in Parliament by anybody else very soon, to be honest.
No, absolutely. And just one more comment, I think it's a really nice place to end, is what's your vision? This is from John Griffin. What's your vision for 2030? What can we achieve by then?
Well, as I say, I work on hydrogen now, and by 2030, we could have sufficient renewables combined with hydrogen to have completely decarbonised our electricity system and to have moved away and possibly significantly changed the emissions from the rest of our economy. So first objection is to stop putting any carbon dioxide into the atmosphere from the generation of electricity by that date, which is probably just about feasible. Only just, but I think it's there. And then, the next area we need to work on is food. It really is the second most important. And I think we can make a great deal of difference to the UK diet by that point. I'm looking at the comments here. Somebody said that it's also actually significant benefit to health. I'm sorry, I haven't got my glasses on, so I can't see who it would be. Sophie Goodall Smith. Vegan diet can bring real health issues. You've got some things to worry about as a vegan. Are you getting enough? I'm sorry. The thing which you can't get except, forgive me, I've just forgotten. But for the vast bulk of vegans, it's been one of the best things that they can do for their health.
B12, I think.
Yeah, B12. There was something. Sorry, God, what's linseed got? I'm sorry, it's just slipped from my mind.
No, there's a lot of things. The vegetarian myself.
Omega
3. There you go.
Yeah,
got
omega
lots
3.
of things.
Omega 3. I'm sorry.
Got lots of vegetarians and vegans in the audience.
I really should have known that. Apologies. Apologies
at all.
to everybody. It just completely disappeared from my mind.
Wonderful. Well, Chris, you've been fantastic for giving us such a comprehensive tour of, the most important issues we're facing on the planet. No question about it. And it's wonderful to have a true expert with us. So thank you ever so much.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. The good thing really is everybody now is beginning to realize around the world that this is the most significant threat that the world has ever faced.
Most definitely. I'm with you there.
Okay.
Excellent.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you ever so much, Chris. And just before ending, just to, and we're getting some great comments, everybody thanking you. If you want to unmute and applause, you're very welcome to. And but I think you can tell from the chat, everybody really enjoyed that. It was excellent. Okay. So just enough time to put up our next event, which is on June the 3rd. And I'm really looking forward to this. I'll be interviewing Sue Stewart-Smith, who's written a fantastic book called The Well-Gardened Mind, which is all about the joys and benefits of nature, the healing benefits, the psychological benefits on our physical well-being and being out in the garden, being out in nature. So it's very much one of my favourite topics. So we'll look forward to that. And you can sign up at Greening Stenning on our events page. A reminder that you can buy Chris's books at Stenning Books, offering 15% off. Please sign up for our mailing list if you're not on it. We've had lots of new volunteers in the last week. We'd love to have you on board, and we're covering most of the subjects we talked about tonight, whether it be transport, home and energy, food, recycling, farms. We're covering all of these. We've got projects in all of these at a local level. And I think Chris has offered to give us some advice on some areas. So the more we can work together on this, the more we can achieve. So thank you all for attending. And I hope to see you next month or next Green Drinks. And thanks again to Chris.